Thanks very much, Tim. Next slide, please. And the next one. And there you go.
Lithium-ion batteries power billions of devices, headphones, cameras, laptops, e-bikes, almost anything you don't need a cord for. But all those combined are a drop in the ocean compared to what electric vehicles need, which is why demand for lithium is predicted to outstrip supply by 2025. Other critical materials like cobalt are sourced from countries that don't care about the environment, don't care about human rights, and don't care about corruption, leading to ethical and supply chain issues. Lithium Australia is researching lithium ferrophosphate, a type of lithium-ion battery that doesn't require commodities from conflict zones. LFP is also safer, cheaper, and more efficient, and operates over a wider range of temperatures. Lithium Australia's proprietary processes offer a seamless pathway from the mining and refining of raw materials through to battery production, and finally, the recycling of spent batteries to create new ones, ensuring a more sustainable industry. Lithium Australia controls 4 distinct business divisions. The Raw Materials Division, which has investments in listed lithium explorers and equity ownership in lithium projects. The Lithium Chemicals Division, which has developed 2 novel processes, Silage and Lena, to improve the viability of existing mining operations and enhance energy security where conventional resources are scarce or non-existent. Silage extracts lithium from mine waste to deliver inexpensive lithium with a low energy footprint. Lena utilises fine or low-grade spodumene currently discarded by conventional lithium concentrate producers, which renders existing ore reserves more economical. The Batteries Division, which includes a pilot plant and lab-scale production and testing facilities that specialise in battery cathode materials, primarily LFP. Numerous patent applications are pending, and the nanotechnology has been awarded significant research grants by the Australian government. LFP is the fastest growing sector of the lithium-ion battery market, and with only 2% currently produced outside China, alternative sources will quickly become critical in securing a diverse global energy supply. And lastly, the Recycling Division, which collects, sorts and shreds spent batteries to recover critical materials for new battery production. With these 4 divisions, Lithium Australia leads the world in securing an ethical, secure and sustainable battery industry.
Okay, next please. From that, you can probably gather that the company has a suite of technologies, one that dovetails into each other, one after the other, and as a consequence provides a complete ESG solution for the battery industry, starting off with low energy extraction technologies, going into the production of high specification battery materials, and then ultimately picking up those batteries and starting the whole cycle again. I'll tell you today a little bit about the battery division and the recycling division. Next slide, please. And here's the team that provides the expertise behind all of that. A lot of grey hair or no hair, a huge amount of experience in the chemical industry and the mining industry. Next, please. I'll talk firstly about the battery division, and that's centred firmly around lithium ferrophosphate, LFP, that contains no nickel and no cobalt, and is the fastest growing sector of the battery industry. In fact, if you go back only a couple of years, it was about 10% of the battery industry, and today it's over 50%. Next slide. And this is the growth rate of LFP, and it has been to a large extent a China-centric product, but the market is growing so rapidly that everything that's produced inside China, I think the video says 98% is produced inside China. Well, the market's growing so fast, it's now 99.5% produced inside China, a very small proportion produced outside China, but the growth rate is very, very fast. And we're seeing a transition from nickel and cobalt batteries to LFP on ethical grounds, cost grounds and safety grounds. And you've only got to look at companies like Tesla that have gone from 100% nickel and cobalt based batteries to now 50% LFP, and all the other EV manufacturers are following. But a phenomenal growth rate. And I think what the market needs to do is develop alternative supply chains that don't go through China. And the reason behind that is simple, in that there's very little manufacturing capacity outside China. There's a big demand for the product, or the end product, as LFP batteries, and there's no one producing the active material that needs to go into those batteries. So we see the emerging markets for LFP being just about any country that produces batteries outside China, primarily Europe and North America. Next slide, please. So what's it all about? If you compare the battery chemistries, there are a number of them there. The numbers on the right-hand side in that little panel are the ratios of nickel, manganese and cobalt. So you've got NCM 622, which is the most common EV battery. It does suffer from some performance problems and cost problems. And then you go through the rest of the nickel and cobalt batteries. Place you don't want to be on that spider diagram, by the way, is in the middle. So best properties on the outside, worst properties on the inside. And as you morph the chemistry and take more of the cobalt out, everything becomes a compromise. But if you have a look at the lithium ferrophosphate LFP, it exceeds the performance of most of the other chemistries in every department apart from one, and that's energy density. That can be fixed by different battery architecture and slightly changing the chemistry. Next. So where do we do this? We do most of this in Brisbane pilot plant that we've had. It's been in operation now for 20 years. Most of the time devoted to LFP. It's developed a very simplistic flow sheet, very, very effective, great from an environmental point of view because there are no recirculating loads. There are no waste products, liquid or solid to discharge, and it produces a consistent product day in, day out. So it runs rings around most of the other processes that have been developed inside China. And we believe this is the answer to quality control and the ability to provide a product that has very high ESG credentials. Next. I'll now move on to Envirostream. Envirostream is the only fully licensed lithium-ion battery recycler in Australia. We own 100% of that company. It's got a number of divisions. It's got 2 operating plants in Melbourne. It's got a diverse collection network around Australia, collects the batteries, sorts the batteries, separates the materials, and those materials go back into the battery industry or other scrap metal industries. We recover all the scrap plastic, we recover aluminium, we recover copper, we recover the nickel, cobalt and lithium from those batteries. At the moment, the market is too small in Australia to justify the capital expenditure in downstream refining. So some of the active materials, being the nickel and cobalt and lithium materials, get refined in Australia, but most of that is now done in South Korea. Next, please. You can see here, it's a little bit old, the data, but it certainly serves to prove the point, in that on the left-hand side, we've got batteries coming into service, the right-hand side coming out of service. There's a lag there of around about 8 years, which is effectively the average life of the battery. And this is pretty important, particularly with respect to the EV industry, in that the EV industry's producing product that the consumer is consuming today. We don't expect to see those batteries for a number of years, apart from warranty recalls and accidents and that sort of thing. But what that means is within a short period of time, we're going to have to be catering for the recycling of millions of tonnes of these things, and that's going to grow very rapidly. In Australia, we've got an interesting situation in that the Australian battery industry has entered into a stewardship scheme which effectively charges a levy at the point of purchase of the battery, that money goes back to the Stewardship Council and ultimately goes to the accredited collectors, sorters and recyclers of that material. We own a large proportion of that supply chain. I'm glad to say the stewardship scheme now introduced is starting to fund those activities, and we are getting cash flow out of that. And of course, by doing that, the stewardship scheme effectively commoditises waste batteries, which means they have an assigned value and prevents them from going to landfill. So the volumes available for recycling are increasing also. Next, please. Move on to the next one. So what's the business all about? It's about creating a circular economy. That's about developing the appropriate technologies that make that circular economy work, and to a large extent producing the shortest route from mine gate through to motor vehicle. The industry is littered with processes that were designed not for purpose, legacy processes, and as a consequence, it really does have too many process steps in it. We've endeavoured to get rid of as many of those as we possibly can and then cover those technologies with international patents. We're positioned well with respect to future demand for batteries and the recycling of those batteries, and we have a very active and successful team driving this forward. I should say that our view on the LFP market is it's not only going to be driven by safety and cost, it's also going to be driven to a large extent by legislation. If you look at emissions legislation, it's going to be introduced into Europe. That'll have a big impact on the battery industry, and ESG legislation is going to be introduced, which includes provisions for upstreaming and downstreaming all of the ESG provisions. And as a consequence, anyone that produces batteries in Europe will have to be responsible for the entire supply chain. The days of Australia producing lithium concentrates, shipping those to China to produce a lithium chemical and then into Europe or North America or wherever it may be to make a lithium-ion battery are just about gone. And we've got to change those supply chains. We've got to reduce the number of process steps. We've got to reduce the carbon footprint. And we've got to make sure that we can comply with all of the best ESG requirements available. Next, please. So that's the Lithium Australia story. We are the only company listed on the ASX that has direct exposure to the most rapidly growing part of the battery industry, LFP, and we do provide a complete ESG solution for energy storage. Thank you.
Thanks, Adrian. A really interesting story. You've obviously a little bit ahead of your time, given you've had a factory in production for 20 years in a pilot form. Can you explain why it's kind of hasn't progressed out of that pilot level?
Oh, certainly. It's a great question because it is progressing out of the pilot level. And I certainly should have mentioned that we're currently going through a feasibility study to do a couple of things. The first one that'll drop out of the feasibility study fairly early in the piece is for the development of a so-called pre-qualification plant to meet the requirements of the EV industry, which are quite stringent from a quality control point of view. And that plant will be scale at somewhere between 250 and 500 tonnes per annum. And the way you do the pre-qualification is initially you start off with small samples that go out to battery producers. And I've got to say, we do that on a regular basis, and we're testing in 8 countries around the world presently. Then they'll ask for larger samples and larger samples and larger samples to the point where your pilot plant can no longer produce them and you need a larger plant. So that's the first thing that drops out of that feasibility study, and that'll be the design parameters for the pre-qualification plant. And that'll be complete hopefully by the end of the year. The rest of the feasibility will cover a commercial scale plant to supply sufficient material for full production runs on a regular basis. And the scale of that'll be about 10,000 tonnes per annum LFP powder. Location, our preferred location is North America. At the moment, North America has 8 plants on the drawing boards that will produce LFP batteries, and they don't have a single plant that produces LFP powder required for those batteries. Bit of a gap in the market, and particularly with Biden's battery blueprint that says within a short period of time, all of that supply chain within North America, or the United States in particular, producing lithium-ion batteries is going to have to be domestic. So you won't be able to take LFP powder out of China. So I mentioned the effect, the impact that European legislation is going to have on the industry, and the US battery policy will have a similar effect. So different reasoning, but they'll all have the same impact. And it really means you've got to shorten those supply chains and start producing this stuff domestically. You can't take it out of China.
No, that's certainly a theme that's pretty well understood by the market at the moment. So as a producer of LFP, when do you get to that kind of offtake stage, and what sort of interest have you seen recently, given this LFP interest in particular?
Look, we've had an enormous amount of interest out of China and Japan, and I've got to say we've been producing commercial format cells with our LFP in those two countries for a number of years. So there are relationships that are existing that could get to the commercialisation point very, very quickly. With a strain between Australia and China, perhaps our relationships in China aren't quite as valuable as they used to be, and we will have to concentrate on those other emerging markets, which are the emerging markets, of course, are any country outside China for LFP. So we think the United States is the place to be, and we think we're going to be in a position to be providing material in commercial quantities out of that 10,000 tonne per annum plant in about 3 years' time.
And you've got some investment in listed equities. What's the strategy around these? Are they the source of lithium, or are they a source of capital in the future?
Oh, no, it's intended to be the source of lithium. Well, not only lithium, there are other battery materials and precious metals and base metals in that package. We effectively farmed out most of our raw materials division, and it sits in a number of companies, listed public companies, primarily Galan Lithium and Charger Metals. I think if you look at the way the battery industry is going at the moment, assured supply is becoming a major difficulty, and you've got companies such as Tesla investing fairly heavily in the supply chain from mine level right through to motor vehicle to make sure that they've got secure supply. The arrangements that we've got with the companies mentioned, and I'll tell you what, there are a couple of really good lithium projects in there, and the arrangements that we've got leave us with a 25 to 30% free carried interest in the projects. So when it comes to producing lithium chemicals in the future, subject to the exploration success of those companies, we will have access to that material. So we will then be able to go from resource through to the production of lithium chemicals, for which we have international patents, into the cathode powder, for which we have international patents, and then sell that cathode powder into the battery industry. Pick it up at the end of the day, of course, recycling that material when it's gone past its use-by date.
And Adrian, as you know, with respect, I was looking at the sector. Lithium, we know well, there's been some strong performance. Your share price is weak into what is a very strong environment. What are the concerns here for shareholders, and what's the market missing?
Look, there are a number of aspects, but I think if your primary focus happens to be the battery end, which ours clearly is, and it's the production of LFP, lithium is a cost rather than a revenue. So the high lithium price is somewhat detrimental to the production of that material. The cathode powder price has been rising pretty fast, but they haven't risen quite as quickly as the price of lithium. But I think if you look at the battery materials then across the board, and you look at the compositions that contain nickel and cobalt, the cost of producing those has just gone through the roof, because the cobalt's gone up, the nickel's gone up, and the lithium's gone up. They've all gone up simultaneously. The rate at which the cost of producing an LFP battery goes up is about 25% of that of a nickel and cobalt battery. But I certainly have a view on the lithium price, and I think the lithium price is unsustainable at current levels. And of course, all you see published really is a spot price. Most of the market trades on something like 3-year contracts. And if you go back and look at the median of those 3-year contracts, it's not the $70,000, $80,000 a tonne. It's more like 15, 16. But the number that gets reported is that very high number. We're going to see a bit of demand destruction as a consequence of COVID and plants closing in China, which will be a restriction on the supply chain. And that will, to some extent, decrease lithium demand a little bit. And then I can see pricing coming back to more rational levels, which will be something like the median contract price at the moment. Then hopefully all of the hysteria about the spot price will disappear.
And Adrian, just to finish up, your battery recycling business is a global business, effectively. There's no battery manufacturing in Australia. So how do you get a foothold in key regions like Europe, for example?
Well, no, we're not quite global yet. We are looking at well, the UK in particular. They're not part of Europe anymore, and having a look at the United States. But at the moment, all of our product is, well, it's not all sourced in Australia, but the majority of it comes from Australia. We get a bit out of New Zealand, a bit out of the Pacific Islands, some out of the Philippines, but it's primarily Australian. And to maintain that business, quite frankly, the majority of the expertise is not the technology, it's how you run the collection network. And we have arrangements with a number of the EV producers, a number of the large companies producing energy storage products, certainly LG, Bunnings, Officeworks, all of those I can name. Some of them are confidential agreements that we can't name the counterparties on, but a lot of large players there, and they're pushed in that direction by the consumer. The consumer's sick of seeing things going into landfill, and those lithium-ion batteries have some pretty horrible stuff in them and should never go to landfill. So yeah, it's all about the collection network. I always say that if you want to have a successful business in recycling batteries, the 3 key ingredients are where you've got a stewardship scheme that helps fund the collection. So, that's an environmental issue for governments and the public at large. We've got that in Australia. Where you've got no competition, we are the only fully permitted lithium-ion battery recycler in Australia. Tick for that one. And where you've got plenty of batteries. So where do those other environments or jurisdictions sit? I can't tell you, because you'll go and do the same thing. But believe me, there are other places around the world that have those 3 key ingredients, and we've got them under the microscope, and they will be the next expansion that we see offshore.
Great, Adrian. That's all we have time for. Thanks for your time. Have a nice weekend.
Thanks very much, Tim.